afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us at Brain Connectivity 2021. I actually don't know who all the participants are, but I'm happy that we can be here today. It was a bit of a false start last year, so we decided to delay this meeting for 1 year to move it to today. Just by way of a quick background, this is a continuation of a meeting that's been going on for almost 20 years. This particular one is inspired by the sort of primordial version of brain connectivity, which focused on the notions of brain and mind. And actually the title of the conference was sort of what does the brain think of the mind? And that meeting was inspired by a conversation I had with Susan Fitzpatrick, who's one of the parts of who's going to be chairing a session actually for this conference with us from the McDonald Foundation. To really, Susan and I talk about ways to think about how to integrate all the stuff that was happening in neuroimaging at that time with cognitive models and behavior models, and really think of a way to approach cognitive neuroscience from a different perspective, which sort of spawned the idea of brain connectivity as sort of the platform to do that. Obviously, things have changed quite dramatically in the ensuing 20 years. Brain connectivity has kind of been the forum to discuss these things. And I say discuss because that really is the focus of the workshop, to really discuss what's happening in the field in detail, as opposed to just focusing on presentations per se. So by way of housekeeping, just to say how this meeting is organized, today's session is primarily educational. The speakers have been charged of trying to get the attendees sort of up to speed on the latest and greatest in their thinking, but also share some of their own ideas about how to approach brain connectivity. So the talks today will be on the longer side. They'll be around 50 minutes with about 10 minutes for discussion. The discussion sections actually are much more elaborate in the days that follow. And there is sort of the reverse from having short presentations, about 15 minutes, and then around 45 minutes for discussion. Now, in the past, this meeting was done in person, which made monitoring the discussion a little bit easier, partly because we kept the attendance down to around 100 people. This year, we're looking at about 800 people. Not sure you're all going to be online at the same time, but at least that does present some challenges in terms of how to manage the discussions. So we do have participants who are primarily the speakers for the series that do have the capacity to contribute to the discussion directly, so they can mute and unmute themselves during the question and answer period. For the attendees, what I would ask is to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. And those will be monitored by myself in this particular case with the moderators in the subsequent days. And those questions will be passed on to the chair when the Q&A session actually happens. And depending on the length of the question and the details, you might be unmuted and actually be able to ask your question in real time. Since we do have a large group, please be patient with us. We won't be able to get to everybody, I don't think. But the notion is to try and, again, foster the discussion. That's part of the chairs for each session. Their charge is to make sure that there is a discussion of the ideas that are presented by the speakers. This event is being recorded, so it will be shared publicly later on once we had a chance to edit it out and make everybody look really pretty and sound great. And the full program is available. Calendar integrations can be pushed into Google or iCal. You can download those from the website at the bottom there. If you're going to do social media, please make sure you use the hashtags that are down at the bottom of the screen here so we can track them. Let's see. Before I go to pass the baton off to Klaus to chair the session, I just want to do a quick thanks to the sponsors for our meeting, McDonald Foundation, Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and the Krembil Foundation have contributed to support this meeting. I want to thank my co-organizers, Olaf Sporns and Sean Hill. And finally, a huge thanks to Tanya Brown, who's been zooming around trying to get everything coordinated for the next few days. So thank you, everybody, and I thank you all for attending. And I will now go to the next slide, which is the session. Start with Victor, Andrea, Break, Petra, Bratislav, and Michael Mack. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass the baton on to Klaus to chair the session. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Randy. Good morning, good evening, hello to everybody. It's great to see you all, if only online. Welcome to the educational session. We have an exciting program, so let's get started without much further ado. Our first speaker is Viktor Jirsa, who joins us from Marseille. He's at Aix-Marseille University, also group leader at CNRS, the director. He's a virtual brain leader. I guess we'll hear more about the virtual brain later during the proceedings, also from Petra. He also leads a work package at the Human Brain Project. And for anybody who's involved, you know that this is not a small task, but he does that very aptly and very charmingly. He's a man who speaks more languages in one sentence than most of us in a lifetime. And today he will speak about network dynamics, distribution, and inference. What are they and how do they relate? Viktor.
Thank you, Klaus. This was a charming introduction. Yeah. Let me share my slides. If I do that. I assume you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So excellent. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and actually kick this off here in the educational session. When I was invited, I was asked to talk about dynamics, give an introduction to dynamics, and then have a little bit liberty and freedom to angle it the way that I want to, and that's nice. So what I will do is actually I will give you a kind of hopefully pedagogical approach towards dynamic system, but then address along the lines as we are talking about dynamics, we will talk about the relevance to networks, to probability distributions, to inference, to ways of describing the dynamics. Yeah, this is the motivation for the today's organization, and it's great to see this also in the context of the subtitle of this year's brain connectivity workshop, that is on consciousness and of cognition. And talking about cognition, so brain function in general, I wanted to place it in particular in the context of predictive coding. So I will address some issues that are relevant for predictive coding, assuming that this is one of the notions that will come up in later talks, in the discussions, particularly Lisa Feldman-Barrett or Carl Friston will probably couch it in this particular context. Yeah? When talking about predictive coding, we are taking the hypothesis that the brain constantly generates and updates an internal model, a mental model of the environment. And the way it does it is this model generates predictions of sensory inputs that are then these predictions are being compared against the actually incoming input, so the information from outside of the world, and prediction errors are being generated that they are being used to update and revise the mental model. And when you go into the literature, there's probably also many discussions that we will have here. They evaluate neurological plausibility primarily from the perspective of prediction. And there Bayesian inference plays a very important role. So I want to pin it down actually to two types of formulas that you see represented here. So here we have Bayes formula represented. Probability times a conditional probability provides us with the joint probability. So that's one mathematical representation that is directly linked to the generation of the prediction. But the actual model, the generating model, has a different form of representation, and if we are comfortable of accepting a time continuous mathematical formulation of such a model, then typically it is cast in terms of ordinary differential equations where we have a state variable x, where you put in relation with each other a time derivative with a nonlinear function f that depends actually on the state x, and then a set of parameters. These are flows. So these equations are referred to as flow equations because the time derivative is, when you span it in state spaces, actually identifying a direction in which the state evolves as time goes on. Yeah, what this is, I will refer to this later. Yeah, it is an equivalent matrix, and actually the goal of today's discussion is to derive this, and we will end up on the same slide here. Yeah? So I want to focus on the aspects of generating models and dynamic systems and the way we can represent them and how they connect to other perspectives in the context of predictive coding. And essentially, mathematically speaking, such one of these equations looks as follows: time derivative, nonlinear flow, state. Yeah, I do not actually wish to discuss the mathematics. I want to discuss the concepts that are behind that. Yeah. In the simplest of all cases, we have a one-dimensional state space. That means x is a scalar value, and we can span it along a single axis. This is the x variable. And then we can have multiple flows on it. We can have fast flows going to the right to increasing values of x, or to the left, or slower flows typically in the neighborhood of what we call a fixed point. Fixed point is any point where x dot equals 0. So the flow is stationary. Yeah, the flow is 0 at this point. Yeah, and this is another fixed point, and you see the distinction. It's unstable versus stable. What this typically means is that when you're here directly on the flow, you have fluctuations around this point, then you always return to this particular fixed point. Yeah, and this is indicated by these arrows. Same thing, just in the opposite direction for the unstable fixed point. When you have many arrows, you go fast. So you have already quite lots of detail in there in this representation, but the link to the mathematical equation here is not entirely obvious. And for this, what we typically do in dynamical system theory is we plot a second axis, which does not mean that we extend the state space. The state space remains to be this one axis. This is a dummy extension, in a sense, to help us to represent this formula here, because x dot is here, x is here, so we can actually plot f, an arbitrary f, yeah, as a function over x, yeah. And given the flow that I designed down here, this would be something reasonable, because this function f has to go through 0 at this point and at that point. And then in its neighborhood, it will have small values, positive values. X dot being positive means you go to the right. Negative values, and here we are negative, it means we go to the left. Why does it mean we go to the left? Because x increases towards positive values here to the right. Yeah? And when it's far away negative or far away positive, it's going fast. So we have actually a mathematical representation of this function here. Yeah? And we know actually, just by looking at this function, we already know everything about this system. And now we can manipulate this function. Before we do this, let me show you a concrete representation here, the sine function, for instance. Here it's positive. The slope here is positive. Here the slope is negative. So that makes this an unstable fixed point and this a stable fixed point. Please note the arrows that are represented here. And the sine function goes to infinity to the left, to the right, and minus infinity to the left. So more or less the situation we just discussed. And the corresponding time series for this sine function that you see here, I'm plotting this line here again. Yeah, so pi stable corresponds to this one, minus pi stable. And then the corresponding time series, look at this. Yeah, you move away and converge towards a stable fixed point. If you start in the neighborhood of an unstable fixed point, you move slowly, so not a steep slope, then you accelerate, and then you go down. This is essentially what you see here. From here, slow, fast, slow, represented here. And then you have separatory seesaws, and this is an object like this unstable fixed point that separates this region from that region. It's actually quite nice. And now I can actually move forward with the geometric interpretation of what we are seeing, in fact. Yeah, let me go here into this section and have a local discussion of this only here in this area. And that is essentially what you see here: fixed point to the left, stable, fixed point to the right. And this is essentially the time series that we just discussed. Yeah, I can approximate this by a square function, parabola. It's not exactly a sine function, but you see that the topology of the flow is more or less the same. It's easier to understand for the parabola k negative. It goes like this. If I move k now positive, what that means is I take the parabola and I push it upwards. And then I have a situation like this. Yeah, no intersection, which means the system flows the whole time without stopping, since we have no fixed points. And if we start somewhere here, then it looks roughly like this. You go slowly and then you accelerate. And you can have also a situation where the system with the two fixed points, stable and unstable, collide in one point. Yeah, so let me go back. Oops, sorry. Let me go back to this one and I move this parabola up. So these two fixed points approach each other and then they collide here in this one point. Yeah, so this point is metastable. It is stable in this direction, unstable in that direction. So at this point, actually, you have already got an intuition that just discussing what we call the fixed point skeleton. So the organization of the fixed points, it tells you everything about the system. So how many fixed points you have, what are the areas in which dynamics can involve, stability, etc. So you can infer everything from what we call the topology of the flow in one dimension. It's completely determined by the fixed point skeleton. One aspect I wish to emphasize, because we will need it, I can go locally now on each fixed point, like this one, and perform what we call a linear stability analysis. So linearize the system on this point. And then what we have is the slope. So essentially, it's nothing else than a so-called Taylor expansion, where this part here is the slope at this point of x0. Yeah, I can estimate or approximate this system. When you look at this, I linearize the system essentially around the point x0. And in its neighborhood, I can infer all its properties in terms of stability about the flow here, but I cannot make any statement at all here. You see actually the divergence between the red curve, my approximation, and the black curve. So keep this in mind. Linearizing around fixed points makes sense because we can make meaningful statements about what is happening locally, but not meaningful statements what is happening globally on the overall organization of the system. But our systems are typically nonlinear. Here you have a cubic representation. There you can have 1, 2, and 3 fixed points. So you have a bistable system. Left and right, you have stable fixed points. In the middle, you have a separatrix. This is a corresponding time series. So separating these two regimes. And what we can always do in one-dimensional systems, one-dimensional in the sense of the state variable, the flow, the way we have discussed it, we can always write the system by means of a potential. Potential is a nice illustration of what the system can actually do. Intuitively, imagine you have a well with two minima, left and right, and you can actually sitting on top of this well, and then you can actually go either to the right or to the left. Yeah, but at the end of the day, don't forget you're moving only along this x-axis here, but this potentially gives you a nice visualization and very often useful illustration of what can happen in the system. For this flow with the bistability, this is a potential. It's the double well potential. Yeah. So this is useful, and these are essentially the two types of representations that you can look at in the presence of noise. Then in the neighborhood of a fixed point, the system is actually being kicked to the left, to the right. So we need to introduce fluctuations in this context. Yeah. So here we have the stable fixed point, the flow to the left, to the right, and you're going fast, fast. So this is a representation of the potential. When I linearize the system, as we discussed it, whatever the nonlinear function is, I can go to the fixed point and linearize it. And then I can also compute the potential here. In this case, for any linearization, it's always a square. What I can also do, and that is useful in applications, is when I have a linear system like this, or actually also for every nonlinear system, but in 1D, I can always compute a stationary distribution function in the presence of noise. Yeah, and for this, something I don't have time to discuss, but the way how it works is I add in noise in this system, and then I can rewrite the system actually as a so-called Fokker-Planck equation, which actually provides me, when I compute the stationary distribution, with an explicit expression of its probability distribution that you see represented here. And I can write it directly as a function of the potential. So for a given noise strength Q, in any linear system, I have always a quadratic potential, and there I can always write the stationary probability distribution function as in this form. And if the system is linear, then this is nothing else than the Gaussian distribution, because the potential is quadratic. Look at this, x squared. So I have a probability, a square probability, not square probability, a Gaussian distribution because of the square potential function. Keep this in mind. So these things are linked with each other. Gaussian distribution equals a linear system or a linearized system with a stable fixed point. Yeah. So another notion that is important in this context is the notion of bifurcations. Yeah, and you saw that already when I moved this square function up and down there. We changed actually the fixed point skeleton, and by virtue of doing this, we changed the topology. So the topology of the flow. Whenever you change the topology of the flow, we talk about a bifurcation. So that is a qualitative change of the local dynamics. And there are a handful of bifurcations in one dimension. I listed them here. The saddle node bifurcation I already showed you. These concepts generalize also to higher dimensions, but it's extremely useful to get kind of an impression for what happens in 1D, because then it helps you to understand better the more complex situations in multiple dimensions. This is what I showed you earlier. This is a factor k that I increased from k being negative, as you see here, towards k being positive. And then there is this bifurcation point here in the middle. And you have again flow along this axis, the corresponding time series, and the corresponding potential. So here it's a cubic for the what we call the saddle node bifurcation. This is all that can happen in a system like this. Yeah. And one convenient way of writing what I'm just showing you here and collapsing it very simply in one a simple figure, which we call a bifurcation diagram, is the following. Look at the positions of these fixed points here, stable, unstable. I'm plotting them here again. This is the x-axis. This is stable and unstable. And then along this axis, we have the k parameter. So for positive k is going in this direction. How did I say it? Negative k is going in this direction. Sorry. For negative k's, we have the bistability and the position changes. And for positive k, we have the saddle node bifurcation. These two fixed points collapse, and the system has no fixed points anymore. So we have gone through a qualitative change. So these were type of concepts I wanted to get across: linear versus nonlinear, expressed in terms of fixed points, bifurcation, and multi-stability in higher for the nonlinear systems. When we go to higher dimensional flows, what that means is essentially we are adding more state variables. Here you have the situation we just described. When you go to 2, 3, or higher dimensional flows, in principle, everything holds and generalizes the way I have described it. We still have flows, but now we don't have only fixed points, but we can have something like what we call a closed orbit. So this is a cycle. So this becomes a limit cycle. And like this, we can describe oscillations. Yeah, or we can have orbits that require spanning in higher dimensions, actually. Yeah, like on a cylinder. Yeah. Then we refer to this as a manifold on which actually this trajectory evolves. So we cannot go into this here, but what I take away from this discussion is that we can describe the model, the generative model that we are interested in, that generates a representation of a predictive representation of the outside world, that we can actually describe it by this type of objects. These are the attractors that we are using to describe the properties of this type of model. Here, I want to show you a very specific representation thereof, a two-dimensional system, because I want to go in a little more detail, in fact. Yeah. So we have two fixed points, and you see the trajectories move to the left, to the right. So this time we have again a separatrix, but it appears to be a line separating these two regimes here. And where these the flows x dot equals 0, y dot equals 0, this is a definition for the fixed points that we have here. Typically, there is a fixed point in the middle also. Yeah. So we can apply the type of discussion we just had. Yeah. In certain cases, definitely in the linear case, I can again write it as a potential. Yeah. So we have a linear equation, epsilon x, and x is my first state variable, y is my second state variable. And I can write it as a particular potential when they are uncoupled. Yeah. And with the potential, I can then compute actually the stationary distribution function that is then represented down here. And if these, so it's a Gaussian in this dimension and a Gaussian in that dimension. And if the parameters here are the same, it's fully symmetric, actually, rotationally symmetric. Very beautiful. And I have a representation here of the rotationally symmetric potential. So I can compute this analytically, actually. This is important for us because when we go to higher dimensions, it becomes non-trivial, because what we can measure in real world situations is actually the correlations. Yeah? We can measure the mean or variance of individual variables. Sorry, this should have been y and y squared, and xy. Yeah, so cross correlations. This is 0. Yeah, and this is where then the probability distribution functions play a role, which I can again compute analytically. But when I introduce a coupling here, a coupling term, now y is coupled to x via a term beta, and same thing here, then actually this distribution function changes. Yeah, and I can still compute the actual probability distribution function, and I can actually, in this very simplistic case, I can actually separate it. Yeah. It turns out to be, again, a Gaussian function. But look, what we are having is x squared, y squared, and the xy term. I can arrange using very simple procedures. I can actually rearrange the equation such that I have an exponential term with a squared expression here. This is a Gaussian, fully expressed in terms of y. And then I have a mixed term here, generating x and y. This is the interaction. In terms of base, as we discussed it earlier, this is actually the conditional probability. And this expression I can actually identify with a free energy F that I can, for this example, I can actually compute unambiguously and analytically. So this is a virtue of this type of examples. Recognize also this interaction function is quadratic. And we have a Gaussian approximation, not approximation, a Gaussian representation here. This works only, of course, in the representation of a linearization, and the linearization is a local approximation in state space. Yeah. Where it does not work, and that's the reason why I said not an approximation, not approximation, is when we are in the fully non-linear case. This nonlinearity means we can have multiple attractors. We're not localized to a linear environment. And then we have more interesting potentials with bistability. This is V of x. And again, we can compute the stationary distribution functions, which looks actually like this here. We can do this also numerically and simulate that, or we can compute it analytically. Here you have a representation of the corresponding two-dimensional potential function for the system here. This is the minimum in the valley, minimum in the valley, and you have the double valley here. You see the projections. So this is still okay, and we can generalize this also to nonlinear situations as long as the system can become stationary. What we are sorry, I thought there was another slide. What we can do now is estimate this type of distributions. There are different ways to estimate it from the data. And I'm showing you here, there are different techniques estimating it from the data. And you see here an example that is actually coming from experimental data, but I want to get a very specific part across. That is the following. Very often we do not know what these distribution functions look like. And there are but we need actually a representation thereof. Yeah. And in this case, Stanislas Ulam in the 40s and 50s has developed something which is nowadays called Monte Carlo sampling, and represents a very important technology, because we can actually sample, so estimate the distributions through repeated random sampling. We introduce a seed value, and then we generate a new prediction thereof and see whether it satisfies a particular criteria that is linked to our deterministic model. So typically, this is intended to solve problems that are deterministic, and we're using randomness to do this, to solve the problem. But what we are interested in are actually the deterministic features. like in the previous example where I showed you, where we computed the free energy explicitly. In linearized situations, very often a Gaussian representation works quite well. In nonlinear systems, what we can run into is that we have situations where we have multimodal representations. And then a Gaussian approximation does not work. In Gaussian approximation, we use very often variational inference, where we assume a mathematical form of this function. Doesn't make any sense here. It works quite well here. Maximum a posteriori techniques, it's also analytical. We are actually going for the maximum in the distribution that we see here. But the Monte Carlo of Markov chain is a technique, is the one that actually samples this, but requires huge resources, computational resources to do this, but at least you get an unambiguous representation thereof. Edwin James in the 60s, 50s, 60s, he has actually developed the maximum information principle, in which he postulated that there is actually an unambiguous criterion for the amount of uncertainty that can be represented in such a probability distribution. And this, remember that in the probability distribution, there is our knowledge about the deterministic features that are in the system. It happens that this knowledge agrees with our intuition that broad distribution represents actually more uncertainty than a sharp one when all the fluctuations disappear. So for this, we use the classic P, ln P representation of information. And we can generalize what we learned in our discussion here to correlations going to very large orders, and actually all deterministic features can be expressed in lower and higher order correlations unambiguously. So the language is we can expand it into the momenta to estimate the probability function. Using a technique which are called the Lagrangians, yeah, which is actually allowing us to describe these deterministic features as boundary constraints or side constraints, we can actually again determine this probability distribution function. And you see it again. If this is a square, we are ending up again with the linearized systems. But now he very beautifully generalized this and actually created generalized this as a concept and spoke about entropic forces, where the partition function that is linked to these deterministic constraints in the context of uncertainty can actually be derived against all the parameters that are in the system here, represented as alpha. So these are the entropic forces that drive the system to a maximum distribution in the context of deterministic forces. That's actually quite beautiful. It fits fully consistently with thermostatistics, where we have entropy, inner energy, temperature, these terms, but it also can be translated to the non-equilibrium applications of nonlinear dynamics, where we are driven outside of the thermal equilibrium. And that's the reason why I wanted to put it into this context here. Yeah, to embed it, that there are very deep foundational concepts that are consistent with mathematics that we're discussing here, actually. But there are still things that are missing. Yeah, so we have the entropic forces that are driving us to within the deterministic context to get a maximal distribution to adapt to the amount of uncertainty that we have access to, so within the deterministic context. But how can these models be actually constructed when we are having a system, a nonlinear system that is driven outside of the equilibrium? Yeah. So with the situation that we're dealing with, in particular in the brain, is that we are having high dimensional nonlinear systems that are exploring, that are interacting. And then through this particular exploration, we have an emergence of a low-dimensional dynamics that is represented of this generative model, this mental model that we spoke about earlier, yeah, and it has to be lower dimensional, typically restricted to a few degrees of freedom. Otherwise, it would not be otherwise it would be systematic. But it has to be sufficiently compact in order to be able to make meaningful statements. Yeah? And here I wish to make reference to Hermann Haken, actually, who posed actually this question: under what conditions can we get actually such an emergence of the low-dimensional dynamics? Yeah? And what he did is he made actually reference to a certain phenomena in nonlinear dynamic systems where we are actually getting close to these bifurcation points, and he saw that we can use actually a theorem that exists in this domain, the so-called local center manifold theorem, that allows us to actually explain how this contraction of complexity in a low-dimensional system can actually occur. Yeah. For this, we have to go locally. Yeah. In the state space, yeah, and you can actually go in the place where the bifurcation occurs. So bifurcation occurs means the phase flow in this local environment changes. I go on the fixed points or some attractor. I linearize around this. These are the first linear features, but then I express everything in terms of the local features, also going to nonlinear expressions. I can essentially perform a linear stability analysis, compute the eigenvectors, and then express everything in terms of these low-dimensional expressions, but express the nonlinearities also, which I can do through a Taylor expansion. And while doing this, in the neighborhood of the bifurcation, you can actually describe how this low-dimensional dynamics emerges. Yeah, that is one possibility of doing it, but it essentially narrows you down to be in the neighborhood of these bifurcation points. What we have been looking into are actually other mechanisms in order to create this compression of information. And there, in particular, I wish to share some ideas with you on symmetry. Yeah, and because symmetry, you may have heard about the Emily-Noether theorem. Symmetry can be expressed in terms of invariant quantities, because symmetry always implies a particular invariance of a given quantity. Yeah? And this, under these conditions, we would not be constrained to a linear local, or sorry, to a local subspace, but hopefully we can actually englobe the interflow of the inter manifold that is then represented of the inter system. Yeah, let me skip over this part here, where I can actually show this systematically and go directly to this very intuitive example that we have here, where we deal with X and Y, so a two-dimensional system along the lines we discussed it earlier. Yeah, two-dimensional. The difference is we do not, earlier we had a bistable scenario with two stable fixed points. Yeah, I'm not requiring this actually. What I require is that there is a certain symmetry in these equations where we have a manifold, not just one or two or three fixed points, but a manifold composed of these fixed points. And that means if this is a fixed point, this is a fixed point, this is a fixed point, I can actually define an operation that gets me from here to here to here to here and does not change the flow, because this here is a so-called invariant manifold on which the flow is always zero. I can actually mathematically formalize this, and this you find under the notion of equivariant dynamical systems in the literature. And the symmetry condition I just pointed out can actually be characterized or operated by an operator, by a group theoretical operator, which is essentially this shifting that I just spoke about here. when something like this is given, you can actually, this type of symmetry, you can actually demonstrate that there is an invariant property. In this case, it was the circle. But when we break the symmetry, and in the neighborhood, we have the following situation. Now, this one circle corresponds to the flow of x dot equals 0, and the other circle to the flow of y dot equals 0. So where these lines intersect, I still have fixed points. Yeah. And where these lines are narrow and close to each other, so this here is very narrow, the dynamics is very slow. Yeah. But there may be a flow on it, going, if this is an unstable fixed point, going from here to a stable fixed point. So by symmetry breaking in the neighborhood of a symmetry point, I'm actually able to generate this type of attractive flows that are going along this manifold. I'm not obliged to reduce it to a local description here and don't know what is happening there, but we can actually do this systematically here. So let me show you a few simulations of exactly the situation I just described. We have a two-dimensional system. You have a symmetry. This is a circular symmetry I just described to you. This is a two-dimensional state space. And this is the same formulation I showed to you on the previous slide, but now we are breaking the symmetry. We're breaking the symmetry in a particular way such that we have one stable fixed point here, another stable fixed point here and here, unstable fixed point, unstable fixed point, unstable. I could have broken it differently. For this simulation, I chose to do this in this particular way. And you see how the dynamics gets attracted down there. And we have a manifold that is attractive, that has a particular lawfulness in terms of evolution of its trajectories. What we are after is a model that lawfully describes certain behaviors. We chose mathematical equations in terms of ordinary differential equations to describe this. What we are discussing here is a way of doing it systematically through symmetry breaking in that particular system. Yeah. So what we can do in addition to this, we can now run it with noise, and then actually the system is sampling the manifold and the stability of the system in terms of its fixed points. So the system is sampling its phase flow topology and the geometry of the manifold. So these are the two ingredients that are actually necessary for us and that then express themselves in the correlations that we can actually measure through the stationary probability distribution function. So I'm trying to make cross connections across the different elements that we have already touched upon. This here is just another example to show you we can go beyond 2 dimensions. In this case, I think it was a 20-dimensional simulation, a similar invariant manifold, breaking of the symmetry. And then in this case, we generated a stable distribution, one fixed point here, another fixed point here. And then the dynamics goes from here down to this fixed point. Let me actually go to the next slide, because there you see actually the manifold being plotted. It's spherical as implied by this representation here. And the dynamics evolves, goes down, and then it gets a kick and goes over to the other side. Yeah. So it can be done in very high dimensional spaces. So can we connect this beyond its theoretical beauty? That's at least what I think. Can we connect it also to neural network systems, the way we are working with? And the answer is yes, to some degree. We are doing this in the virtual brain framework. Petra will speak about this intensively. All I wish to express here is that we will discuss here now just one network node. And what we use in the virtual brain is typically what we call neural masses, where we actually compress the activity of different neurons. We split it in excitatory and inhibitory neurons, and then we apply mean field techniques to actually average some of the activity in non-trivial, in intelligent ways. And then we obtain mean field equations, yeah? One low-dimensional equation for the inhibitory and one low-dimensional equation for the excitatory. And there are many of those techniques depending on what you mechanism you choose to average over, yeah? What type of, again, correlations enter here, yeah? What type of correlations you assume. But my point is the following. When you look at the models that are on the market available, one that we use very often is Zalo et al. From Alain's lab, or Montreo et al. Ernesto's, yeah? They have a very similar flow topology. Typically, they look as follows, yeah? And here you have representations for different parameters, but typically they always look as follows. You have one variable and another variable. This one is typically the firing rate, R. This is a mean neural membrane potential. And there you have what I called earlier the null lines, they intersect, yeah? And you have one intersection, another intersection, another intersection, yeah? So this makes 3 fixed points. And when you look a little sharply in this, you see this is a stable fixed point. You see there's also a stable fixed point, but it's actually oscillating down. It's a spiral. And this is an unstable fixed point. Yeah. So you always have a bipartitioning into one regime, into another regime, and a separation in between here. If we ignore for the moment this oscillatory behavior and just make it a fixed point, then you can actually see that this corresponds to the phase flow topology that we have here, where this is a down state, recognized in neural language. This is the up state. This is the separatrix that is up here. And this would be, if there are oscillations in the up state, would be oscillatory, but we have it compressed here to one-dimensional dynamics. Yeah. Actually, if we can accept this for a moment and look at this as a one-dimensional system, and then look at 2 of those completely uncoupled, then we have X here, and we have Y here. And then we have, along this direction, we have the stable, unstable, stable, the same thing I just showed you. But then Y does the same thing, stable, unstable, stable, unstable. So we get actually a grid structure. And when you simulate it, and actually Claudio did that in my lab, he's doing his PhD on this, you see actually you have here a manifold, flow goes to this fixed point, unstable flow, flow. So you have a manifold here, and here you see the vector pattern. You can do the same thing also in higher dimensions, but then start building it in 3 dimensions, a grid structure in 4, 5, 1 million dimensions. But you get this beautiful structure here for unconnected neural masses. If you connect them now, actually, we're not connecting yet, sorry. I can rewrite, bear with me. Look at this, we can actually write it in this form. I write in this term here minus y squared, and then plus y squared. For g equal change a thing, yeah? But please recognize that this is what we discussed previously. This is actually very closely related to this invariant manifold here, where for g equal 1, it is identical to the squarey structure. But for g not equal 1, we have actually an invariant manifold here that is slightly deformed, that can be either described by a deformed square or by a deformed circle. Yeah. So in the neighborhood of symmetry breaking, we're actually generating stable, 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 stable fixed point, and the others are unstable, exactly as in the simulations I showed you. And we can do the same thing for 3D. Then we have a higher order structure on a 2-dimensional sphere spanned in 3D, or we can generalize it completely, the unconnected system. We can generalize to be these invariant spherical manifolds plus a coupling term. And for Cij equal 1 and g equal 1, it is identical to the system. But when I want to call it disconnected, then what we are having, let's call it connectome for the time being, we can actually start making changes to it and generate flows on this. Yeah. In the remaining 5 minutes, I would like to walk you actually now how we can connect it to these flows that are being generated if this were here a connectome. So this here in this form is completely unconnected. If we have now a very, very high dimensional state space, yeah, and project everything in 2 dimensions, it would look spherical because it's completely unbiased. Spherical distribution, as you see down here, yeah. And then we can increase the coupling value towards bigger values. So have the symmetry breaking effect of the connectome in there, and this is quantified by the G value here going in this direction. What I can do is actually I can compute what we call functional connectivity dynamics. Essentially, functional connectivity is a covariance matrix. And what we can do is actually we can compute the cross correlations between sliding windows, functional connectivities, or do this instantaneously. That's what Olaf has done also very beautifully with the edge functional connectivity dynamics and plotted here. So this would be cross correlation of edge functional connectivities. And for increasing G values, you see the symmetry breaking effect of the connectome comes in and generates areas of invariant functional connectivity here. And if I just compute the upper triangle variance and plot it here, what you see is here that we have sweet spots of loads of functional connectivity dynamics. We refer to this as fluidity because it plays an important role in aging. Yeah, in Demian Battaglia's work, he showed that very nicely, that this fluidity is something that is being favored as a description of the functional organization in the brain network. So what happens when we increase the G for corresponding to these different functional connectivity dynamics, you see the symmetry breaking actually, and it starts deshaping, deforming the manifold from spherical to acquiring certain geometries in there and certain flows in there. Yeah, and these flows we can actually look at, we can quantify. This is now, I'm taking this particular picture, this parameter setting, this working point, and we can go into these epochs of invariant functional connectivity and actually extract these subsets of manifolds and look what they look like actually. And we can actually run this systematically, a full simulation. This was Paul Triebkorn in my lab who did that actually with the FCD and plotting the functional connectivity in the sliding window as we go through here. Then you see how the dynamics evolves as the system evolves along the manifold, is sampling the manifold during the resting state. Yeah. For sake of time, let me split that. I want to skip that. I want to show you one more thing to show you that actually these complicated manifolds that you could think of, we can get them only through simulation. We can get them actually also through thought. Yeah. Now that you understood how this manifold, this grid structure has been created, and that is composed of up and down states, and then it shapes a manifold on which we can have flows. You can actually start making statements. There should be a preferred direction, everything going down to the down state, at least at this sweet spot. Yeah, this can be done one way. There are many ways, but you can span the two-dimensional subspace. This is a projection on the Laplacian eigenvectors. Yeah, this is Kashyap did that in my lab. You see, when you, in terms of preferred stability, you have less stability here and increased stability here. So you have a direction going in this direction. Yeah. When you look at the in strength, because this is how we break the symmetry with the in strength, the accumulation of the connectome, you can actually correlate the Laplacian eigenvector in this direction that is being plotted here with the in strength. And you see a wonderful correlation. This is for simulated data now. Yeah. Same thing for the second eigenvector, Laplacian eigenvector, and there it's left-right symmetry. And if you do this, then this actually represents to a gradient across frequencies. So in strength, because our variable that we're looking at is rate, firing rate across that, it correlates with in strength, which correlates with the first Laplacian eigenvector, and you see a nice correlation with the peak frequency, actually. And when you do this across lobes from occipital towards frontal lobes, you collapse that actually, you see the nice gradient coming from simulated data, but also when we look at empirical SEG data from many subjects. This is work that Huifang Wang has done actually. Yeah, you can actually plot out this gradient from occipital towards frontal areas and confirm this empirically. And this is just based on pure thought and understanding of the symmetry that you have in this particular organization and thinking in terms of invariant manifolds and flows. And that's essentially what I wanted to get across to you in this discussion today. I wanted to introduce a concept of dynamic systems and manifolds, which is actually the mathematical object that describes the reduction, the information compression on low-dimensional subspaces, which must be the representation of the generative mental model of the environment that we are talking about here and that we will probably talk about in the next few days. If, of course, under the assumption that we are dealing with time continuous differential systems, which is not a bad assumption in this particular context. And this type of representation, there is a whole field in behavioral psychology, such as ecological psychology or coordination dynamics, that are trying to estimate these functions here on the behavioral level, that and hoping to find a representation thereof on the brain imaging signal level that we were dealing with here, because these are accessible through the brain signals. So that deterministic features that are in this model can be linked to correlation functions, can be linked to the distribution functions, can be linked on a larger level to maximum information principle, to the free energy, and to the inference, because what we want to do is actually estimating and sampling this type of distributions. So these are the links I wanted to share with you. If you're interested, some of these, at least from my perspective, with the structured flows on manifolds, you find here some of the publications. And otherwise, I already mentioned quite a number of people in my lab that are working on this. They are present here and over the next few days also. I thank them, I thank you, and I thank our funders. Klaus, all yours.
Thank you very much, Victor. I clap for the very large audience that listened to your very clear and well-structured talk. We're a little bit over. I'll let you go because it was really fascinating. But we have time for maybe one or two questions. And I would take them from the Q&A. So Matteo Mancini asks, can we use microstructural measures to inform neural mass models and tailor them to behave as specific neuronal populations? Microstructural measures.
I do not know what a microstructural measure is, I must admit.
Maybe on intrinsic connectivity or cytoarchitecture, I'm just guessing, or maybe
the
properties.
So if we are talking about properties in terms of within the neural mass, if we want to create a population that has particular properties, then this will affect, of course, the behavior. What I did here today is I used these neural mass models to be identical. Yeah, so all the symmetry breaking I spoke about was completely focusing on the connectome in the latter part. However, of course, you can break the symmetry in different ways. You take cytoarchitectural properties of the brain region in which you are, yeah, and that will then you have non-identity of the individual masses, and then this will also create and determine the flows that are on these manifolds. There is no question about that, and we can do this systematically, and it fits perfectly into the formalism that I presented to you, because we again generate these invariant manifolds, and everything that does not fit for the invariance we take outside and this provides a symmetry breaking term. Of course, this makes only sense if the situation is that the symmetry breaking is small. Yeah, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Another big contaminating factor is actually the oscillations. The upstate can be oscillatory. Why do we need oscillations in the brain in this particular context? What does it do to the flows on the manifold? Yeah, they are not always there. Yeah, because we have a high and low firing rate situation. What do the oscillations do? Do they couple models? Do they separate them? Do they link them? I have absolutely no idea. And now I hope Claudio, my PhD student, will address this issue very soon. Oh, poor him.
It's quite a challenge. So we have one more question, and I'll read it and I'll ask for a brief answer so we can continue on time. Very interesting talk, says Mai Chen Yu. 2 questions. Does our brain generate nonlinear time series? If so, what are the strange attractors in our brain? And the second question is, if our brain is a nonlinear dynamic system, which phase space at what dimension could optimally describe our brain at different states? In other words, how can we translate the state in the phase space to the resting and or task state of our brain network? That may require a longer answer, but maybe try to just get to the gist of it.
Yeah, the gist of this is, please recognize that nonlinearity is the rule and not the exception. Yeah, if the system were not nonlinear, we would undergo the fate of instability, for instance, going to an unstable orbit and then epilepsy, and we would never ever stabilize again. We need nonlinearities. And what we find in this type of population dynamics, very, very strongly represented, is actually the multi-stability. So nonlinearity is the rule. Yeah. And then out of this, that's the reason why we chose to construct the invariant manifolds through these methods that I described today. Through this, we then are able to generate low-dimensional models, these manifolds, in a controlled fashion. How dimensional? It's actually, I cannot make a statement about this. Yeah, it's the meaningful lawful behavior. How many dimensions do you need in order to generate meaningful lawful behavior? In terms of motor coordination, it's possible to measure. There we had 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions maximum. Yeah. How does it apply? How does it translate to cognitive functions? Yeah. In order to be coherent and lawful, it will have to be also sufficiently low dimensional. But I don't think we can make very generalizing statements about this.
And I'm afraid we will have to leave it at that. Thank you again, Viktor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope it was useful. Yeah. Thank you.